Welcome to the True Crime Never Sleeps podcast. I'm your host, Larry Lace, and today is a special episode that begins the series Shit Out of Luck. It's a story of how criminals, past and present, were captured, from bank robbers to serial killers to terrorists. Everybody's an option. So this week, we're starting with the son of Sam and his capture. To stay up to date with all of my content, check out the Twitter at True Crime NS. You can also subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. This show is sponsored by Poddex. Visit poddex.com and use code TCNS to save 10% off your order. And the link will also be in the description. Today we're going over a case where the killer was found and justice was used against him. He is still in prison and will be there for eternity. If you're into true crime, you might have heard his story a few times. Today's episode will not focus as much on the story of his crimes. We'll pay attention to how David Berkowitz, also known as the son of Sam, was caught. Before going into detail on how he was caught, I want to create some context. I believe there is no doubt that he was guilty and should face the consequences of the law. But what he did was insane and makes us pretty scared of people like him. In this podcast, we talk a lot about the common characteristics of serial killers, so please pay attention to the next several sentences as they will describe the reasons David Berkowitz became a killer. David Berkowitz was born as Richard David Falco. He was born on June 1st, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. His mother was Elizabeth Broder, who grew up in a very poor Jewish family. She worked as a waitress to try and live with the bare minimum. In 1936, she married Tony Falco, an Italian-American. The marriage was very problematic, and they didn't seem to get along. The marriage lasted a bit less than 4 years, and the reason it ended? Tony found another woman. In 1950, Elizabeth started a relationship with a married man named Joseph Klinman. The relationship was okay. She was finally getting back on her feet when 3 years later she became pregnant with a child to whom she chose to give the last name as Falco. It seemed like this was going to be an amazing time and she would get to live the unconditional love of having a child. Only a few days after Richard's birth, Elizabeth gave the child away. Reasons are still unknown, but it's public opinion that the father might have put pressure on her to abandon. Then, David was adopted by the Berkowitz family, and that's where he got his last name from. The family described David as somewhat troubled. He was tough to deal with and was consistently getting in trouble because of misbehavior. The family even asked a psychotherapist for help because of how bad he behaved, how normal his actions were, like setting things on fire. When David was only 14, he lost his adoptive mother to cancer, and then his behavior got worse and worse. There's no need to keep giving more information about his childhood. We can all agree that he had a very troubled childhood, and that would shape his behavior for the rest of his life. It sadly explained many of his crimes. There was 9 murders that he was responsible for that we know of. First, in December 1975, was the Foreman stabbing, and then the year after, in July, was Gloria and Valenti shooting, and then just a few months later, the Denaro and Keenan shooting in 1976, and then the month after that, in November 1976, was the Demasi and Lomino shooting, and then 2 months later, was the Frond and Deal shooting, followed by, in March 1977, apologize if I butcher these names, the Verskian shooting, and then next month was the Isan Siriani shooting, and then in June 1977 was the Lupo and Placido shooting, and then his last murder was the Moskowitz and Violante shooting in July 1977. First real suspicion about him happened many years later when Cecilia Davis was walking her dog somewhere near the Moskowitz and Violente shooting when she saw a patrol officer ticketing a car. Some minutes after the police left, a young man walked past her from the area of the car, and he seemed to look at her in a weird way, demonstrating some interest. Cecilia felt concerned because he was holding something on his hand, and she didn't feel safe. She ran to her home and heard shots fired behind her in the street. Cecilia didn't mention the situation to anyone until she could hold it in. She couldn't hold it in anymore. She finally contacted the police. The police closely checked every car that had been ticketed in the area that night. The police found out that the car was under investigation, and the connections started to appear. The police found a rifle and a bag full of ammo. This is heavy ammo. No one would just carry ammo that around and even leave it in the car with no supervision. This person was up to something. The car was in front of 35 Pine Street. The police waited until he left his house. It was the best option when trying to catch him while avoiding drawing even more blood. The police successfully caught him, even after a scary moment where he pointed a gun to the police officer who approached his window. But thankfully he had backup when he was able to make him drop the gun and surrender. David was eventually charged with second-degree murder and attempted second-degree murder. He killed 6 victims and wounded 10, including 1 stabbing. All of these crimes happened during the span of just 1 year. And that's a wrap for today's story. As we all should agree, crimes are never good and bring sadness to countless people. It is important, though, for us to try to understand the reasoning behind such tragedies and create awareness to avoid it from happening again. From True Crime Never Sleeps, I'm Larry Leese, here to bring you the best stories full of details and knowledge. For more information on the podcast, consider following me on Twitter and Facebook at True Crime NS, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. And once again, we'd like to thank Poddex for sponsoring this podcast. Just check them out at poddex.com. Use the promo code TCNS for 10% off your order. Thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow.